and Mona and the team of young students will ensure that these days are well spent. Thank you very much, all of you. Welcome.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful words. Moving forward, I would like to request Mona Iyer, ma'am, the Dean of Faculty of Planning, to address the August gathering.
Thank you, Prerna. A very good evening to all the colleagues, all the participants, and all the dignitaries present here. Thank you very much for taking out time for this deliberation and to be part of this UTC 6 at CEPT University, which is very ably coordinated by my colleague, Dr. Anil Roy, and supported by all my faculty colleagues and student council, whom we will interact over coming 4 days with as session moderators and participants. As many of you may be aware, UTC Urban Thinkers Campus is an initiative of World Urban Campaign, which is driven by UNHABITAT, and it provides an open platform for deliberation amongst urban thinkers, be it researchers, practitioners, students, professionals, and helps us to move towards positive urban transformations. It started in 2016, and now we are in the 6th season. And we understand that about 200 events have been organized across the globe. And this year's theme is Climate Action for Cities. And these events, they provide us the mental and intellectual space to pause and to reflect on the urban transformations and related challenges, ideate our ways to meet our common challenges. And with this outlook, our UTC journey started last year, wherein we joined in the UTC 5, and we had deliberations on planning, pedagogy, policies, and practice in light of COVID-19 while we were amidst COVID-19. We had about 700 participating urban stakeholders from 180 cities in 17 countries, and we had about 20 speakers from 7 countries. This year, we thought that this UTC could be like a sequel as we are slowly coming out of this pandemic and recovering. And therefore, this UTC 6 has been conceptualized along with our partner TU Delft as an extension of those deliberations with specific reference to placemaking for resilient recovery. At CEPT, we have 6 programs, and undergrad program on urban design and 5 programs in postgraduate, which cover thematic areas of planning, which include urban planning, spatial planning, urban design, urban infrastructure, urban transport, and urban housing. And we thought that deliberating on all these thematic areas or verticals, which make the urban whole, would be a good idea. And we thought that we could decode this resilient recovery through the lens of each of these themes and attempt to decode how resilience manifests through actions in these sectors in urban space. And as Dr. Suhrut placed before us, that we look forward to witness and be part of deliberations, which will also focus on vulnerability, precarity, and bareness, as he said, as manifested in urban arena in all these thematic areas. So with that, we look forward to the deliberations by the dignitaries and overcoming 4 days by various experts who have agreed to join us. So thank you very much and welcome once again to virtual CEPT UTC. Over to you, Prerna.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now like to request Taneha Kuznikov-Bakhin, ma'am, our coordinator from our partner TU Delft, to shed light on our collaboration with TU Delft.
Thank you so much, Prerna. It is a major honor to be part of such an important event and actually to not only be part of this event, but especially to cast light via this event to an important collaboration that it has been happening between CEPT University and TU Delft. And again, it's a great honor from our university perspective to be alongside with you in these upcoming days with such a rich program. And I would like to continue the words that started the day on the importance actually of the care, let's say the ethics around care in redefining the scope of resilience. And it's something that I believe it's a strong component of the partnership that we have initiated recently via a cooperation in the Netherlands on urban water systems, which is called Water for Change research program. And it's very much on trying to understand how actually we could envision a resilient future, especially within the context of secondary cities in India, but coming very much from this, let's say, sensitive approach of understanding places, understanding different cultures, and let's say from the past to the present and to the future, what might be sensitive and let's say close site-specific and in close contact with communities ways of envisioning change, and especially how does water in this specific context could be a catalyst of change. So I think an important point that also from the Dutch perspective we have been, let's say, questioning our profession. It's actually how can we move from a risk-based society, and especially again from the Dutch context, but also I believe strongly in the Indian context, that's very much true. So coming from a risk society and actually move towards a resilient society, and the diverse dimensions of resilience, which also was mentioned before, that actually we have to take into account, and what might be the role of placemaking, of spatial planning and spatial design in that. So that I would like, in this, I would like just to mention some important points that in this, let's say, coming from a risk-based society to resilient approach actually might entail. And it's, for instance, the moving from, let's say, the understanding of tipping points as something that actually is a threat, and actually seeing them as an important opportunity for transformation. So how can, by planning and design, again, we can envision important systemic transformations that are needed to take place to continue, let's say, to foster quality of life from present to future generations, and especially in the idea of sustaining intergenerational quality of life. Another important point that also by means of this cooperation, strong cooperation that we have in place between our two institutions, is the idea of designing adaptation pathways, so transformative pathways in the future. So what might be, let's say, the narratives behind the making of such pathways of transformation. And again, as mentioned before, what may be the ethics, the strong ethics and the, let's say, the protocols of care, the methods of care that we are embedding in such pathways. And then finally, the point of understanding what may be creative constructions, in that sense, visions, let's say, of the future, but very much, again, landed into specific planning strategies and design experimentations that would allow us to envision, again, the landing, the implementation of such transformative pathways in, again, in transforming places, but also in transforming and coming from culture and society. So I also strongly believe on the power of care and empathy, that actually, and also as democracy, as the welcome speech was so clearly stating. So the importance of that in guiding any project, any transformative project that will eventually provide for resilience, let's say, the maintenance and the improvement of resilience capacity in our different contexts. Another point, let's say, important point of the project, now reflecting from the point of view of Water for Change project, is that how actually also we might use specific projects, let's say, being academic projects, but especially projects which also make strong effort to connect with practice, and in that sense, coming from research and education to a strong connection to practice, how let's say the work on specific projects actually might also help us to make, let's say, to mainstream a resilient-based approach to society and the environment. So what might be those projects and how actually we can envision this mainstream of specific, let's say, positions and specific forms of care from present to the future. So eventually it's about thinking of sensible ways to go forward. What might be the sensible ways to go forward? How can we use specific projects to help us in getting there in mainstreaming, let's say, change? And that eventually, that along the way, we might need to revise even. And I hope that in these upcoming days, that would be very much at the core of the discussions, how actually we can revise the role of planning and design as, let's say, the trigger of these needed changes in organizing actually different positions throughout different disciplines. So actually that by means of planning and design, we can gather the input from different disciplines, from a multidisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary way, and again, be able to move forward with, let's say, from, as stated, from a state of fragility, vulnerability, and risk to a state of intergenerational sustainability and, again, and quality of life. So thank you so much. And sorry, just a very final point, that the strong collaboration that we have between our institutions, it's something that also moves, let's say, beyond the scope of this project, and it comes from the past. And I hope, again, that by means as well of this platform of the Urban Thinkers Camp, that actually continue in other ways, but also, for instance, with other forms of international collaborations that we have from the context of TU Delft, with 3 important countries that we have as, let's say, as partner countries, envisioning the scope of innovation in research and education, which is India, Brazil, and China. So again, very much looking forward to these days, and very honored to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, moving forward, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Joe Fellin. He'll be delivering the special address. Dr. Joe Fellin is the director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development India. It is an organization of over 200 companies working together towards making businesses not only successful, but more importantly, sustainable. Dr. Fellin and his team focuses on core business solutions in areas of climate and water, and advancing the case of sustainability in businesses. Prior to joining WBCST, Dr. Joe led the work of the International Business Leaders Forum in India. I would now request Dr. Joe Fellin to share his insights with us on urban resilience.
Thank you very much, Prerna. And all of that was wonderful, but I'm not a doctor. I don't have that qualification. So please, yeah, but thank you otherwise. So I really appreciate being invited to speak. And as you heard in the introduction, I work for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're a business organization, and it's really important for us that we get to hear from academia and from civil society and other parts of society. And you know, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you, you know, our perspectives on resilient urban or built environment. And you know, I hope it's useful for all of you in your deliberations. I'm going to share a presentation. So I'm just going to check that you can see this. Are you able to see that? Thanks, Prerna.
Yes,
okay,
sir,
so very good. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about WBCSD, and then I'm going to share with you how our members see resilience, what their vision is, or what their positive vision is for the built environment, and the transitions that they think need to take place in order to achieve that vision. So just very quickly, we're a membership organization. We're global. We're headquartered in Geneva. Our members come from more than 60 countries around the world, including some Indian majors like the Tata Group, the Aditya Birla Group, Godrej, ITC, UPL, JSW, companies like this, and from all sectors. So we're multi-sectoral, all food companies, manufacturing companies, services, all logistics, all are represented. But they're united by a common vision, which is to create a world where more than 9 billion people live well and live within the limits of the planet. And I'll speak a little bit about that vision. We're a business organization, so we focus on the core business of companies, and market-based solutions. So working so that the market rewards the more sustainable businesses, so that incentives are aligned and drive money towards more sustainable outcomes. I mentioned that that more than 200 companies are members of the World Business Council, and their logos are here. And you would know many of these companies, whether they're headquartered in India or in the Netherlands, or anywhere around the world. And let me also say it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Delft University, and also thanks to Dr. Anil Roy and the team for organising this event. So, we're at the centre of massive change at the moment, and it always feels like our moment in history is kind of more complex than the last. But from a business perspective, the way that we're operating currently is not sustainable, because it's increasingly economically risky. Here in India, we experience the environmental perils. I was in Uttarakhand a couple of weeks ago and was stuck without power or connectivity for a few weeks. People lost their lives because of floods. If you're in Holland, you're well aware of the perils of rising sea levels and floods there. We've had the COP in Glasgow, which is one focus for public unrest, but equally I'm based in Delhi, and there's been 18 months of protest over farming reforms, and this is being translated increasingly into legal risks for companies. So here are just two examples where a court has ordered a company to cut emissions, and activist shareholders are taking seats on the board of companies to demand a change in their climate position. We're also, now 20 months into, or 19 months into this COVID pandemic. We suffered terribly here in India. We feel there may be more waves coming. No one can predict that, but equally, we feel we want to, move on safely with our lives. But it's shown us very, very clearly how interconnected all of our lives are. As soon as one piece of the puzzle went down, especially in that first lockdown when we didn't understand it, all kinds of unintended consequences happen in terms of global supply chains, or just the softer infrastructure that helps us run our lives, helps us live well all the time. Again, in India, we saw massive human suffering and inequality in terms of the daily wage workers, what happened with them. Just illustrated how unresilient we were, our lack of resilience, and how poorly prepared we were. And also, amazingly, much quicker than we anticipated, we found vaccinations, with science leading the way and business following, and that is part of what offers us hope with climate change. So from a business perspective, and this is what I'm sharing, these pressures translate into physical risk and financial risk for businesses. And this graph just summarizes what we all know and what I've been talking about. The first map of the world shows where the climate risks are greatest globally, and we're right in the middle of that here in India. The second chart shows the monetary damage to Indian companies of climate-related risks, and for business, the same is true of cities, where physical assets that can't move, are the most vulnerable. And all of this is in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll talk a little bit about shortly. Each year, the World Economic Forum tracks global risks, which are most likely to happen on the left and which will have the biggest impact on the right. Green risks are climate related. So you can see that over the last 10 years, climate related risks have risen dramatically up the table, both in terms of likelihood and cost. Now, this is the challenge that we face, but there is a clear roadmap, and both came about 5-6 years ago in 2015. The Paris Climate Agreement, India to the fore in reaching that agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals, again, India playing a very important role in getting those agreed globally. And together, these are our pathway to a better future for all of us, where we live well and more in a more resilient fashion. I want to highlight that there are opportunities in delivering this agenda. And I mentioned that we're a business organization, so we're coming from the perspective of market-based approaches. Regulation is crucial too, and I will touch a little bit on that as well. So it's not to say that's not important. But there was a study about 3 or 4 years ago from the Business Commission for Sustainable Development, which identified the value in new markets for India in achieving the SDGs. These figures are in $1 billion, and the blue ones relate directly to cities, affordable housing, energy efficient buildings, electric and hybrid vehicles, public transport. But many of those in energy and materials, for example, and health relate to cities as well, renewable energy, circular economy, resource recovery. So there are huge markets that as our world necessarily responds to both the physical risks of climate change, as well as the greater scrutiny and desire from capital markets to find more resilient investments, those that can mitigate climate change and can survive climate change. Necessarily, markets will transform, and there's lots of value to be found in realizing those markets. Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, Paris Agreement, waste, water, renewable energy, nature, biodiversity, human rights, equality, all these things. Really, it comes down to 3 really urgent imperatives, which all interact with each other. We face a climate emergency, nature is in crisis, and inequality is at unsustainable levels. And these 3 all in, climate change and nature drives inequality, which, if not addressed, drives less sustainable behaviors. But equally, the solutions are interlinked as well. Now, let me speak about business and a way forward. So our members have come together to create a shared vision for tackling these 3 major imperatives, and responding to both the emergencies, but also the way that expectations are changing from customers, from regulators, and from capital. And together we produced an updated vision for 2050, focused on the next 10 years, which we've called Time to Transform. And it's really about how these changing expectations mean that the emergencies mean that businesses, cities, all of us, society must transform, but the changing expectations mean that they will transform. It's going to happen, and it's about the pace it happens at, and for businesses and our members being at the front of that and leading that so it happens faster, and they're at the center of that success. What it all comes down to is everyone in the world living well, which means that everyone's dignity, rights are respected, basic needs are met, and there are equal opportunities for all. And crucially, that happens within planetary boundaries. And the last 2 weeks in Glasgow have been on this second part. But this is climate change and nature, because both are in peril. businesses through WBCSD have identified 9 pathways where action along those pathways will help to, or will result in achievement of a sustainable world. And I'll just put them up here. And these, so everyone online, I'll share, it's time to transform.biz. And these are 9 pathways that you can explore. All of this is in the public domain. Please do make use of it. And actually, all of these do take place in cities. Many of them go beyond the boundaries of cities, but whether we're talking about connectivity, health and well-being, food, water and sanitation, energy, all of these do take place in cities. But I want to just share with you a little bit now, especially on living spaces. So I've picked one with kind of obvious connect to cities, but all of them do touch on cities. So just a few more minutes. So our vision as the World Business Council for living spaces is that by 2050 they promote health and well-being, and the way that we think about and engage with the spaces in which we live and work has shifted radically, and because we recognize the influence that it has on every aspect of our lives, from how we sleep to socialize and how productive we are. And so health and well-being is central to design, and the built environment is designed to meet that as a need. Affordable housing and communities that work for all, adequate, safe, resilient and affordable housing and infrastructure provides inclusive access for all. Urban environments integrate green and public spaces, and again ensure access to clean air, food, water and sanitation. I'm sure that most of the people on this call, including me, live in cities that don't provide universal access to clean air, food, water and sanitation. Thirdly, net zero, resilient, adaptable and regenerative built environment. And climate resilience is also a key consideration in infrastructure planning. And this notion that cities maintain strong links to the environment. And we think about the urban world and the natural world as separate, but designing our cities so they strive for restoration of the natural world. And lastly, living spaces harness the potential of recycled and renewable materials. So they're designed to minimize material use and maximize the suitability for renovation and adaptation. And recycled and renewable materials are regeneratively managed, and that sits at the core of construction. There are these key transitions needed to realize that vision. And each of them has a policy aspect, and you can find this in the pathway at timetotransform.biz. I'm just going to give you, a couple of examples. So, for example, in relation to infrastructure and buildings increasingly integrate and respect biodiversity. So, what we think is that biodiversity becomes a key component of urban planning. And urban areas are designed to ensure universal accessibility to green spaces, connecting people with nature. And nature's value to cities and communities starts to be accounted for. And when I say accounted, I do mean in terms of understanding the costs, the impacts and the dependencies, translating that to financial terms. And that will lead to stronger political and commercial efforts to protect nature effectively. For example, but as I say, in the report, there are policy asks linked to each of these. But in the interest of time, I'm going to jump on. Lastly, I'm just going to say a little bit about how our members think about resilience. And they've identified 3 mindset shifts required for the transformations that the world is going to undergo. Reinvention, in our case of capitalism, resilience and regeneration. And so because of the theme of this conference, let me just share how we think about resilience and a little bit on regeneration. So for us, a resilient business, and you can think about how you would apply this to a resilient city, is one that is diverse in all aspects, is modular, that has cohesion and has adaptability. And the companies we work with and the leaders of the companies we work with are thinking about how to build that into their businesses, so that we can't predict, we understand climate risks, we've now experienced a pandemic, but we can't predict exactly how, what shocks are coming. but by building these characteristics into our unit, our business, our city, we can be in the best position to respond. And just lastly, I just want to share their thinking on regeneration and a regenerative mindset. And all business understand well risk and risk mitigation, and climate change presents lots of risks. But leading companies are working through these stages. So they're all working to be net zero in terms of carbon emissions, nature positive, positive impact in terms of nature, and respecting and upholding all internationally recognized human rights and promoting diversity and so on. But moving into that restorative, net positive space, and ultimately building capacity for self-sustaining abundance of life. So it's a very positive vision, but I think it's really useful so that we move away from only thinking about walls and barriers and drainage systems, and think from first principles about how we create environments that are positive for life. I'll finish there. Here's 3 addresses: timetotransform.biz, which is all on this Vision 2050 work, and the pathways are there, and you please explore them. wbcsd.org, which is my organization, and then lastly is my email address. So I'll finish with that.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful insights, and also for bringing the focus to climate resilience and showing us the way forward. To continue in the same vein, I would now take this opportunity to introduce and invite Honorable Shrimati Sardar Muralidharan ma'am, an IS officer by training. She's the Additional Chief Secretary of the LSGD, Government of Kerala. She also headed the Kudumbashree mission of the Government of Kerala for 6 years, and then went on to be the Chief Operating Officer at National Rural Livelihoods Mission of the Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India. She was Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Panchayati Raj from 2014 to 16, responsible for conceptualizing and promoting the Gram Panchayat development plans that put a premium on citizen participation through the Gram Sabha. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am, and we are very thankful to have you here.
Thank you, Prerna. I'm audible, I hope.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I just hope that I don't disappoint, because it is always difficult for a bureaucrat to come into an academic discussion. We tend to feel like the proverbial bull in the china shop. So having said that, I will get into another metaphor, which is what I'm going to be talking about, and that is, I also happen to be a frog in a well, and that well is my universe, and that's my experience, which is what I will be speaking about here, in the hope that you would be able to interpret and convert that experience into learning, which, again, as bureaucrats, we are famous for not being able to do. So Kerala. Kerala is, all states of India like to think of themselves as unique, and so does Kerala. Kerala has you could say that we are the headquarters of the argumentative Indian. And there's a reason for that, which is, it starts with the social reform movements of the early 20th century, moving forward into educational reform, moving forward to literacy, full literacy, the first state of which was able to proclaim full literacy, which invested heavily in adult education, and through this also invested in political agency. So you will find there is hardly an Indian in Kerala who does not have an opinion and who is afraid to voice that, who's unafraid to voice that opinion, which means that we are a very noisy lot. And that has implications for planning, by the way, which is why I'm talking about it. Because the jury is out as to whether a judgmental citizenry is actually good it's a good thing. The pros are that you have a very inclusive governance mechanism. You would be also enable informed choice, which is extremely critical in decision making. But there are some cons. The cons are that the process then slows down considerably, particularly in times when you need emergency response and action. You cannot really allow yourself to be paralyzed by too much of opinion and the fear of what a decision is going to land you in. So there is therefore there is a tendency towards being very risk averse in dealing with responses, in planning strategic action. Climate action is something which calls for drastic reform, and we aren't doing it. We are forever looking for the low-hanging fruit. We are looking for the soft options. We aren't looking to take the bull by the horns. So that's where we are, and in Kerala. And I would like to then also just take you through our recent experiences. Kerala, 2018, we had the mother of all floods hit us. 2019 was not very different. 2020 was COVID. It's almost as if in the last 3 years we have had back-to-back cyclones hit a state which has been cyclone-proof till now. The Arabian Sea has been misbehaving very badly and has had implications for us. We've always had small landslips here and there, but then we've been having gigantic landslips. We've had entire towns, you feel like the earth is shifting beneath your feet, and you come back and you don't recognize your home, your neighborhood anymore. That's been happening across the board. More than ever before, Kerala recognizes the effect of climate change. And we also realize that perhaps among communities too, as coastal community too, we are extremely vulnerable to climate change, perhaps more so than some of our other states. A friend of my daughter very nonchalantly came and showed me an app in which she said, Auntie, this is how Kerala is going to be in 2030. We are not going to have, Kochi will be underwater, parts of Kerala will be underwater. There's not even the sea is going to reclaim its own. And Kerala, as legend goes, was actually reclaimed from the sea. So it seems like we are going back to the origins. And how do you handle that? How do you handle the fact that the Trivandrum city airport is not likely to be standing 10 years from now, because the roads anyway leading to the airport have already been eaten up by the sea? So we are facing this on a day-to-day basis. But we also have the problems of, again, highly engaged, highly involved citizens on the one hand, who are blaming the government for not doing anything about the Madhav Gadgil report, but on the other hand saying that don't you dare touch my land. So it's and that not daring to touch your land, interfering with that could also mean that you lose your opportunity to govern the state. So it's a very difficult call for a political leadership to take. And that's something that we are grappling with. And this is something which we see in the way that our cities are handling this as well. So, when COVID hit us, COVID also brought with us certain unintended consequences. The lockdown and the slowing down of the economy was something which we were all expecting. But we did not expect in-migration from both other states as well as from other countries to Kerala of the extent that happened. So there was a phenomenal increase in people who came to Kerala and who didn't have jobs and who hit the cities and were expecting the state to take care of them. As it is, the pandemic exposed or brought us face to face with issues of migrant labor. And the state responded by thinking of them as, talking of them as guest workers. And there was it is important, to look at that distinction. Why would the state call migrant labor guest worker? For one, it was about dignity and respect. And two, it was also, by virtue of being a guest in the state, they were entitled to hospitality, hospitality bigger than you would give to yourself. So this was important in the way the response that was generated towards handling COVID was concerned. So our local governments, ULBs, the urban and rural local governments, have been in the forefront of the emergency response, be it COVID, be it the floods before that, be it the cyclones, be it the landslides. The first responders on the ground are always invariably the elected representatives, followed by their officials, and then comes the official state machinery coming in, and all through they are there. So Kerala also did an exercise of coming out with disaster management plans for every single local government, the urban bodies as well as the rural. And these disaster management plans then got dovetailed into the Rebuild Kerala initiative, which was an initiative supported by the World Bank to help Kerala recover and become resilient to future shocks. So that was a big plan. And as part of that big plan, urban planning and incorporating spatial planning, incorporating risk-informed planning was something that has been brought into the whole sphere. And our experience had been we've had very interesting experience with that, because when we started off, especially when you're doing something on scale without running it through trial runs, and you didn't have the comfort or the opportunity of doing that, you end up with a very, suboptimal solution. But then, the Kerala experience has been that you learn as you go. You cannot really afford to wait. So you just have to get in and keep tinkering with the program on hand. So we had 29 maps that were given to us, all mapped to the local governments. And these were supposed to be incorporated into our disaster plans. Interestingly, none of them did get incorporated. Not interestingly, it was naturally because of the fact that at the local level, there really was an understanding of how you would use this. So incorporating information, technical information, converting it into knowledge that could be local and understandable to communities is a very critical communication and knowledge gap that needs to be addressed. So that was one thing that we tried to do, and we piloted risk-informed master planning in 2 of the municipalities that have been very badly hit by the earlier disasters. This was Chenganur in the south and Manandawadi up in the hills. Chenganur had seen tremendous flooding. Manandawadi had seen severe landslide. And then what we've been seeing there, however, is that not only does it, it's not just about our being able to bring in the available risk information, decentralize it, deconcentrate it, deconcentrate it, and also demystify it. There was much more, that the information that we got itself was on its own inadequate. For example, we've had our master plans get vetted as part of the RKI initiative. So one of the things we were told was that, you need to actually capture upstream data with regard to catchment trends, to understand how your floodplains are going to be performing. And that was an indication that, urban planning itself, you cannot restrict it to the urban space. You've got to look at the entire, because you're looking at flood-based planning, you've got to look at the entire river, the room for the river, the whoever is upstream and what they are up to. With waste too, we had the same experience. You had municipalities who were doing good work in waste management, but then upstream, if that good work had not been continued, you would find that all of that would come and land up in your backyard. So you had to handle that as well. So this was one thing that was mentioned. The intersectoral functionality, the fact that sectors were not talking to each other, was something that was a problem that we found that we had to address. Referencing codes and standards so that this could be standardized was an issue that was brought up. And then came this question that we really needed to do a risk assessment. So in our plans, we had looked at, you had embankments, and we said, okay, these were safe communities. But then we were also told that the greater the embankment, the more spectacular the embankment breach would be. And when you're having extreme weather events, we really need to look not just at the past, but how the nature and scope of future shocks is something that we would need to contend with, and we would need to address in the way that we are looking at planning. So that is when it was interesting to see that how does one do a risk assessment of cities, and is it possible nationally to bring that kind of risk assessment, which would enable cities to plan according to the level of risk, and also then bring that down into, drop it into various subsets and sub areas and look at this planning. Coming back to the issue of livelihoods. So when you have this influx of people coming in, you already have a set of people who are losing their jobs or partly unavailable. Suddenly we find that our local governments, our urban local governments, also need to take responsibility for local economic development, for finding local livelihoods. And we have, so while we've done wonderful in multiple areas of social development and infrastructure, particularly social infrastructure, but when it comes to economic development and livelihoods, our scorecard isn't all that great. Going back to the drawing board, what we see is that maybe it's not great also because our entire framework of how we support, how we expect local governments to support local livelihoods and support is fairly dated. So the question of how can you bring technologies in? Can you bring this entire startup intervention? Can we bring that in? Can we bring in the idea of a service aggregator at a local level? Would that be possible? So there were multiple things that suddenly, the moment you start thinking, you find that there are opportunities galore which arise out of the crisis. So those seeds are being planted right now. We want to see how they are going to develop. And it would be interesting to see how that concept then matches with the with planning as we know it. I would like to end by talking about the SDGs and localization of the SDGs. Speaker Joe before me showed the SDGs and the bigger picture. The localization of SDG is not that easy, really. For the administration who needs to spearhead this, for the local governments who need to be able to operationalize it, they need to understand this. They do not really know what it means to localize, what does the achievement of an SDG mean locally. The only reference points that we have of breaking up the SDGs are the monitorable indicators, which set by the Ministry of Planning and Statistics and Niti Aayog too. Interestingly, the Niti Aayog, when it in the early days of when SDGs were being pushed and the ministries were asked to look at SDGs, the Ministry of Panchayati Raj did not figure in the list of ministries who were supposed to be engaging with the SDGs. And we said that, you want the SDGs to happen, you really need to get your local governments on board. Because be it poverty, be it hunger, be it gender, be it education, be it water sanitation, be it energy, be it work, decent work, be it infrastructure, be it inequities, be it sustainable cities, all of that, all of these, be it responsible consumption. So today you want to enforce the ban on plastics, you need the local governments to be in the forefront doing that. And ultimately, finally, be it climate action, you need the local government. So that's been the question, however, is how do the local governments understand what they need to do by way of poverty reduction, by way of addressing issues of hunger? How do they convert their action or understand their action by way of outcomes? Because planning through local governments, even when it is led by the state or the center, is completely project linked and is not really outcome or output linked. And the SDG is about goals, it's about targets, and it's about delivering on outcomes. So it is important for us to move from project-based approaches to outcome-based approaches, and to be able to help local governments understand what those outcomes are. And you will find, therefore, we tend to think of our elected representatives as people who would not show the interest in doing any of this, because they're looking at the quick solutions and quick fixes, and therefore would not be interested in strategic responses. But I have personally experienced that has been a failing more on the part of the administration, of being unable to engage with them, of being unable to help them think along strategic lines, to give them data and information which will allow them to see how certain interventions can lead to certain to impacts that are measurable and quantifiable and observable by local communities, which would gain them traction. So that's an entire area which we are trying to focus on right now. And that, of course, means that we would need to demystify our monitorable indicators as well, but we would be looking at building communities of knowledge. We need to bring in not just the elected representative, but the local communities as well. People, youngsters, and that's a big search area. How is it that you engage with the youth who are right now? There is so much of information, overload of information in a sense, which is going on. Is it possible for us to reach out to them in ways in which they could channelize that information and that energy into doing good, into championing the causes, and into forcing local governments and state governments and central governments and beyond that nations and local communities into taking hard decisions which will ensure that we are no longer on a bus as far as climate action is concerned. We are on a rocket. So we've got to scramble and get onto that rocket as quickly as possible. Lastly, I would just like to end saying that my forte, I am not an expert in urban governance, but my forte has always been working in the area of poverty and gender. So, when we talk of gender neutral interventions, these are actually gender apathetic interventions. They are gender blind. They only push us behind and do not help move forward. So we cannot afford to be climate neutral. We have to be climate engaged. We have to be, taking that simile into climate, we have to be climate engaged and climate warriors, because only then will we save ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for shedding the light on the ground reality in urban India. And it also, we realize that resilience and recovery it's something that is very closely related to how well cities respond to to the challenges that are changing every day and how well they are able to evolve. And with that, I again thank you for your kind words. I would now like to move forward, and we have with us our keynote addressee, Shri Sanjeev Sanyal sir, amongst us. I would now like to invite him to deliver the keynote address. He is currently the Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India. Sanjeev sir is an internationally acclaimed economist, best-selling writer, environmentalist, and urban theorist. Till 2016, he was a member of the Future City Committee of the Singapore government that was tasked with creating a long-term vision for the city-state. Apart from this, his environmental work focuses on the economics of cities. He's the co-chair of the Framework Working Group of the G20. He's also been a strong advocate of including walkability and organic evolution while thinking about the development of cities. In 2007, Sanjeev sir was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship for his work on urban systems. He's the author of best-selling books like Ocean of Churn, How the Indian Ocean Shaped Human History, Land of the Seven Rivers, A Brief History of India's Geography, and several others. A very warm welcome to you, sir, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a special pleasure to speak to all of you today. I've been given the impression that I should speak for about 20-25 minutes, so I shall try and do the best I can in that time. Now, the focus of my talk will be about how do you think about living cities in the context of change happening in multiple levels. Remember, it's not just one thing that is happening. You have climate change, but you also have technological change, social change, economic changes, and all of these things interacting with each other. So we live in a very complex, evolving world for which it is extremely difficult to plan. Incidentally, as some of you may know, I'm very much into thinking about things in the framework of something called complexity theory. And so let me explain in a second what this is. Basically, it's about thinking about systems where there are large numbers of moving parts, and they are all interacting with each other in unpredictable ways. Now, as you can quickly understand, that this is a good description of both climate and of cities, but also of many other things, economics, societies, financial markets, languages even. So when you're dealing with complex systems, the most important thing you need to do and understand is that complex systems very often evolve down unpredictable paths. This is an important thing for you to understand, because when a lot of words like master planning are bandied about, you have to understand that master planning, by its very nature, especially the way it's usually practiced in countries like India, require that the planner has a clear view of where the world is going. After all, what are you planning for? So this is a very important first stepping stone that you need to understand, because a lot of people who work in the fields of climate have never actually dealt with a climate model, and not understanding the extent to which these climate models can lead down many paths. Yes, we are going to go through climate change, but climate change is very difficult to predict exactly which paths will go in which part of the country. I mean, for example, I live in Delhi. Climate change could mean that I have more rain. It could also mean there's less rain. I have no way of knowing ex ante exactly where this is going. There are a few things that are probably a little more likely than others. For example, it's likely that sea levels will rise, but even there, exactly how the coastal systems will work depends a lot upon how currents move. Those currents can move in unpredictable ways. So the point I'm making to here is that all those who go around saying that we must master plan for XYZ must remember that we are dealing with complex systems which can go in multiple ways. Therefore, the game is not grand master plans, but the ability to adapt. Climate adaptation or economic adaptation or social adaptation are possibly just as important. So how do you deal with very rapid and uncertain change? Well, this is not so different from how you deal with it when you get an economic shock, like, for example, COVID hitting your economic system. Here, what you have to do then is to hedge for the very worst outcome. And the rest of the time, you have to adapt forward. This is very much about some of the most successful sort of responses to the COVID shock to the world economy and different economies around the world. It's always been adaptation while hedging for the worst outcome. That has been the most successful strategy. I think there's more than adequate evidence of that now. Incidentally, it was also India's own strategy. And so adaptation, step-by-step adaptation, is a very important aspect of adapting to things. Now, why am I talking about this in this way? The reason is that this is particularly true in India, but happens in other countries as well, but thankfully less so these days, is this problem of thinking about cities in particular in the Corbusierian way of machines for living. Now, once you begin to think of cities as machines rather than evolving ecosystems, then you end up with the problem of reductionism, which is that it is about getting the best possible master plan ex ante and then just implementing it. This is what Chandigarh is like, right? Chandigarh has this rigid plan, and you have adapted it. You have not allowed that to adapt, because the whole idea was like a machine. It was all the planner had to have this grand plan in the beginning, and if he got a perfect plan in there, the perfect city would emerge in the end. So this is how people have very often thought about planning in India specifically. But in most parts of the world, by the way, this Corbusierian thinking has been thrown into the dustbin. I'm sorry that this continues to be true today. So now, if you ask the average Indian, what is the best planned city in India? Very often they are likely to tell you that it is Chandigarh. And if you ask them, okay, which is the best planned city in the world, after scratching their head for a few minutes, most of them will also say Singapore. Now, somebody like me who has actually lived for many years in Singapore and actually had something to do with planning, looking at the planning of Singapore over many years, let me show you how Chandigarh and Singapore are completely different concepts in terms of planning. So I'll give you a little bit of history, and then you'll understand why this idea that you may occasionally get, if only we did, Chandigarh better, it would end up as Singapore, is completely and fundamentally wrong. Let's go back to 1965. What was happening in 1965? Well, the city of Chandigarh was sort of coming together. It had been newly planned in the 50s, and it was coming together. And Le Corbusier had come up with a plan that he professed would be sort of the ideal city. And so it was all about continuing to build out that city from here on. And in fact, there was a large amount of land was given to it, huge amount of resources were put in place, and this is how the city was built. And in fact, many other cities since then have been built using that general thinking. Now, meanwhile, in 1965, Singapore had just become free. It became initially, it may surprise you, free as a part of Malaysia. The S in Malaysia is actually Singapore. But it was a densely packed city with no resources at all. It didn't even have enough water for itself, and it was dead poor. There were slums everywhere. There were communal riots. And therefore, the impression many people would have got is that, Singapore had no future. So it had such little prospects that Malaysia threw out Singapore from the Federation, and Singapore rather reluctantly became a free country. Now, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was faced with a real problem because he had this rather densely packed city with no resources. The only resource he had were some naval dockyards that the British had left behind as they were withdrawing. So he decided to use those dockyards to invest into a new sector that was coming up, which was container shipping. And Singapore very quickly became a container shipping hub. He also encouraged a lot of foreign companies to get there, and light industry. And many people may not realize this, that Singapore is the original hub of fake branded garments. So there is even today a brand in Singapore called Crocodile, which was originally started as a fake Lacoste. So that's how Singapore started out in the 1960s. But the 70s, it was already so successful in this field that it began to move up the value chain. And so in the 80s, it moved into electronics. Now, most of you may be too young to know this, but perhaps your professors will remember this, that in the 80s and 90s, if somebody went to Singapore, you would always tell them to bring back electronics. Why? Because Singapore was the global hub of electronics. But by the late 90s, Singapore had succeeded so well in electronics that it became too expensive a place to produce electronics, because that was then moving out to Korea and Taiwan, and ultimately, of course, it moved to China. But Singapore moved up the value chain into finance, later on into education and entertainment. Now, notice here that what Singapore was doing was adapting along the way. Back in 1965, Lee Kuan Yew would never have imagined that Singapore would be a place that people from India, for example, would like to go to study. Because back in 1965, nobody in his right mind from India would go to Singapore to study in Singapore National University. So what happened here is, Singapore is not the result of master planning. Singapore is the result of adaptation and transition management. I want to emphasize this because the contrast with Chandigarh is stark. Chandigarh itself has, unlike Singapore, stuck with the original plan. It's still heavily master planned. And consequently, it's essentially a retirement home for civil servants. It's a subsidy scheme for retired civil servants and some working civil servants. It doesn't have any zest of its own. It doesn't have an economy. It's essentially a subsidized economy. Gurgaon, if Gurgaon ever stopped paying its taxes, you would have, Chandigarh couldn't sustain itself. And to the extent Chandigarh shows any zing at all, it comes from the unplanned parts of Chandigarh, like Mohali, which is because it's outside of those master plans. In fact, even Naik Chand's garden was till recently technically illegal. It wasn't built on forest land. So the point I'm making to you is that rigid plans don't go anywhere. And so those who come and say, oh, we must plan for climate change. Well, yes, plan for what? So very important here is that the only way you can deal with this uncertain world is to hedge for the worst outcomes. So figure out what are the possible bad outcomes that can happen. So if you're a coastal city, clearly you need to think about the possibility of rising sea levels. But if you have a rigid, extremely meticulously worked out plan about how the city will function, where the people will live, how the economy will function, I'm sorry, bureaucrats love doing this, but they have no idea where this is headed. So this is a waste of time. Far better to have loose rules and continuously adapt along the way. And in fact, sometimes it's better not to have any rules or to break the rules than to stick with the rules. And a good example of this is Gurgaon. Gurgaon till the 1990s was basically a rural area. Less than 25 years ago, it was basically a rural area. It had one factory dedicated to Maruti. And when Gurgaon began to urbanize, the original idea was low-rise housing for people retiring from Delhi and moving there. And then suddenly the BPO industry turned up there, and it began to build these factory-like offices, which were, at least to start with, illegal. But since, for whatever reason, these illegal buildings continue to be built, completely in contravention, by the way, of the master plan. And newer constructions came in, new industries came in. And so in this entirely, what should I say, swashbuckling sort of way, a city emerged. And the net result is, oddly enough, that Gurgaon actually, with no plan, has actually ended up having a better sort of economic and social mechanics than Chandigarh. I mean, the proof of the pudding is a very simple one. If there was a 25-year-old who grew up in Chandigarh and there was a 25-year-old who grew up in Gurgaon, where would that person move? Almost 90% of the time, the Chandigarh kid would move to Gurgaon, not the other way around. That is your obvious way of judging success. So the point I'm making repeatedly here is adaptation will always, in the end, beat great plans. And this is something you've got to take into account in CEPT because this Corbusierian idea of the machine for living is a fundamentally flawed idea. Now, how does this filter through to the way we think about, say, a city like Delhi? Delhi today looks nothing like what it does 20 years ago. There's no way to have planned exactly how a metro system would completely change the dynamics of Delhi. But we need to keep adapting to whatever it is. For example, allowing for much greater density in and around metro stations. If we stuck with the master plan, the city would just not be able to evolve. This is even true, by the way, of the central vista. There are many people who get all very emotional when you hear, oh, the central vista is being changed. Yeah, no. You have to allow adaptation. Now, that doesn't mean that you tear down everything that is beloved. Clearly, the buildings of Rashtrapati Bhavan or North Block and South Block. I'm right now sitting here in North Block. You can see some of the windows at the back. Now, these are beloved buildings. We should preserve them, no doubt. Colonial they may be, but they are beautiful buildings and we should preserve them. But to say that we should not change its use and adapt them to a new use misses the point. These buildings were originally built in order to house a colonial government. So if you come here, or if you've ever been to Delhi and have come to North Block or South Block, you will see what is the messaging it has. Well, the messaging is we are the rulers sitting on top of the hill, looking down at the people. So this is the mental idea of a colonial state. I mean, quite apart from the fact that North Block and South Block are no longer usable as modern offices because they're just not constructed to be usable for air conditioning, for all kinds of other things. But simply the whole messaging is wrong. So far better to convert North Block and South Block into museums. Delhi, as the national capital, should have top-notch world-class museums. Why not convert them into museums? There are beautiful parks and gardens around here. Today we can't open them up to the public because of security reasons. Why not open them up? Once their museums have nice cafes, restaurants, a nice place to come and take selfies, the Rashtrapati Bhavan will still remain at the background. Of course, it'll still be there. But North Block and South Block will become great public places and hopefully also get pedestrianized so that, you can go and, at least in the good months of the year, you can go and sit on the lawns and so on. The same conception is true of Rajpath. We're not tearing down India Gate. What is being done is it's being cleaned up in a way that can be utilized throughout the year by the general public. However, that doesn't mean we have to stick with every building that was ever built. There are clearly buildings along the central vista which are poor quality. Not many people realize just behind South Block, there's a whole bunch of Second World War barracks that were built in a hurry in the Second World War and have continued to house offices. You can't ask senior officials to work out of tin sheds. They should be torn down and new buildings should be built, and that is exactly what is being done. Similarly, Shastri Bhavan and all these other sort of buildings built in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, perhaps the worst period in world history to have built anything. And these awful modernist buildings are simply neither good to look at nor are they good to work in. Please visit anybody objecting to the tearing down of Shastri Bhavan should go for a walk inside those buildings. They are creaking, they are leaking, they smell, the toilets stink, the offices don't properly air condition, there is concrete cancer. I mean, there is literally no reason to not tear them down and build modern buildings. So in those areas, they should be torn down and new buildings should be built, and presumably those which are far more efficient at using energy than these old 1960s concrete monstrosities. So the point I'm making to here is great cities are cities that continuously adapt. They adapt to the times. They obviously, when you adapt them, you, however, do need to build into it resilience, i.e. the ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances in the future. But that does not mean that you do not keep investing and adapting. Adapt uses, occasionally adapt spaces, and of course, you have to pay attention to the historical evolution of the place, so that placemaking, after all, there is something to be said about accumulating a history to a place. So you have to, so for example, we're not tearing down North Block and South Block. They're beautiful buildings, even if it was built during the colonial period. But they can be adapted for use so that they become much more democratic and open to public in something like a museum. So this is how we think, this is how you can think about complex adaptive systems as they evolve. And this is the same way, incidentally, you can make policies for economies or societies, or even adapt to something like climate change. Those who have totalitarian views of how exactly to deal with climate change, I'm afraid they are going to lock you into paths where the unforeseen outcomes of the combination of climate change, social change, technological change, and economic change will lead you into getting into situations where you will not be able to adapt fast enough to these unforeseen circumstances. Thank you very much. If there's a Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, sir. That was quite insightful, and it also challenged us to think in new ways, because when you say master plans and development plans should not be so rigid and in fact should have loose rules, so that they allow for easy adaptation, it challenges all the urban professionals and enthusiasts to think along a direction that is, less ventured. And we are very thankful to you for challenging us in that direction. If anybody has any questions, I would request you to put them in the chat box. Also, as we move towards the end of the session, I would request Professor Shashwat Bandyopadhyay to deliver the closing remarks and the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Prerna. But before that, maybe we can look for some questions in the chat box for the speakers.
Yes.
Maybe I begin to Mr. Sanyal, and you gave a very kind of a very nice comparison between a rigid plan and the Singapore plan. But if you also look at Singapore way back in '72, the first concept plan was prepared, and with a very long horizon, which broadly gave a structure and both, but it's a more structure in nature. And Singapore kept on adapting to the changing context and, also the resource challenges. But what do you see some of our Indian cities, the governing structure in some of our cities and the kind of democracy we have inherited? How do you see our cities adapting to these flexible rules and flexible, the atmosphere for growth?
So first of all, we need to teach the philosophical point about adaptation. Right. You see, one of the big tragedies of post-independence India was that we came up with this, in the economic front, this rather stupid idea of having 5-year plans, and this idea that there were wise men, and they were usually men, sitting in the planning commission who was going to tell you where the world was going. And of course, they made a mess of it. And finally, we had an economic crisis, and in 1991 onwards, we have slowly opened it up. Now, this doesn't mean this whole thinking process has been abandoned yet. Sadly, this kind of thinking process is still there in many economic policies, and I have been actively at it trying to dissolve them. But in the urban design fraternity, we have continued to remain resolutely Soviet planners. And India is literally the only country in which Le Corbusier is supposed to be some sort of a good guy. Most countries in the world he's thought of being some insane fascist. So the point is that this Soviet view of the world, that only if we can have this most meticulous possible plan, that we will lead to good urban outcomes. This philosophical framework has to be shattered, which is why I have taken the trouble to come and speak to all of you. Because effectively what you have here is the equivalent of the mindset that led to economic planning, this license permit Raj, right? You have the license permit Raj is alive and well in the urban planning milieu. The building codes, for example, that you have today, they are absurd, right? If you attempted to build the Taj Mahal today, if Shah Jahan turned up and said, I want to build the Taj Mahal today, he would never be able to get his plan passed. Right? So the point I'm making to you is, this is ridiculous. Because the whole, so similarly, if, you know, there are many of our beloved urban landscapes, whether it is, for example, Varanasi, right? If we try to build the ghats in the way today, somebody will say, oh, but you do not have space between the ghats. You need to have a nice wall and there needs to be space between the ghats. It would spoil the whole idea that you couldn't walk along all the ghats because you would have nice boundary walls between each one of them. Right? So this is completely absurd. You've got to allow for certain amounts. There has to be obviously a certain kinds of rules, but those rules need to be general, form-based rules, which allow you to adapt internally what you want to do. So this does not mean, however, that I allow for anything and everything. So I'm not, by the way, in favor of laissez-faire, but I do feel that you need to allow for a certain kind of sensible rules, form-based rules preferably. So this is, by the way, but at the same time, you need to keep doing interventions. After all, Varanasi is the result of thousands of years of accumulation. So, by the way, every great city. London is, you know, the hundreds of years of accumulation led to the way London looks today. Right? And you go to the Louvre, it was originally a palace, then it became a museum. And then, you know, the French put this gigantic crystal pyramid in the middle. But it requires a certain way of thinking, of maybe a certain kind of self-confidence, which sadly maybe our Indian urban planners do not have, to be able to think like this. But this does not mean that that does not mean that we have to be afraid of doing large interventions. Again, I'll give you an example. I obviously gave the example of the Central Vista as an example where large intervention is happening. It's not being done mindlessly. As I pointed out to you, there's a fair amount of thought that has gone into doing it. But the same thing is true of the Kashi Vishwanath corridor, which is being done right now in Varanasi. Certain old buildings are being brought down, true. But that is being done in order to open up certain temples that are even older. So certain choices have had to be made. But this has not been done mindlessly. So certain judgments were made, certain amount of old buildings had to be torn down, but at the same time, the local architecture has been taken into account, religious sentiments have to be taken into account, and so on. And so, but it requires a certain willingness to go out there and be brave.
Yeah. I'm
not saying thoughtless, but you still have to be brave.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sanyal. They are very, very valuable points that we need to be, have more agile change mindset and also adaptive, at the same time balancing between these two paradigms. I see a couple of questions that are sprawling in. I hope, Prerna, we can have a couple of minutes to take up this question. Is that fine?
So we can take maybe another question.
Okay, so I request Rutul Joshi, if you could just speak out your question.
Okay, thank you, Shashwat, and thank you, Sanjeev sir, for being here and for this wonderful talk that you gave. We are all a big fan of your books. I mean, my question is more related to that. Yes, of course, the Corbusier idea has been detrimental in some ways, but also the normative and bureaucratic planning, which dominates really the planning world today. How do we really sort of get past that in India now? If you can throw some light on that.
I'll give you some thoughts on this. So first of all, there is the Corbusierian planning and the bureaucratic process are the same thing. Corbusier was just a super bureaucrat because he created the grand plan and then he put a stamp on it saying nobody can ever change. This is the ultimate form of bureaucracy because bureaucracies love precedents. So therefore, you've created one grand precedent that shall never be changed. So the point I'm making is that there's no difference between the bureaucratic thinking and Corbusier. The alternative is an adaptive system, which requires you to take risks and think forward, look around you and be thoughtful, but where at the same time, not get too worked up about precedents, But so in order to take certain kinds of risks that you need to be able to do to create new urban spaces necessary for our times, that requires imagination, not bureaucracy. Therefore, great cities have always needed these kinds of interventions. The Paris that people love is due to big intervention in the late 19th century. The London that you see today is partly adaptation, but also big interventions. There were two major interventions that happened in the last 500 years to make London look like it does today. One was the Great London Fire, 1666, and the other was the bombing of London in the 1940s. Many of those old buildings you see in London, by the way, are entirely recreations, incidentally. Most of the old buildings in London were actually bombed to the ground. And that is also true of much of Europe. When you go to Europe and wander around these medieval roads, remember they were just rebuilt in just 40, 50 years ago. They are not as old as maybe people are making them out to be. But they had a certain sense of place, and people wanted that sense of place to come back. So they built new buildings in the old style. They were also, however, because they knew, I suppose, that these were new buildings, they were also, in some ways, much more casual about adding completely new buildings in there. So you wander around Amsterdam, lots of 18th century buildings, but you'll find, suddenly a completely new modern building. They are willing to do that because they appreciate the evolutionary nature. Evolution means that our times are also a part of that chain of time. So we are also adding to these things that we are doing. So that's why I am, while I'm a big fan of Varanasi, by the way. And I like the fact that layer on layer has been built up. But then our own interventions, as long as they keep with the general ethos of the place, are also a part of that evolution.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sanyal. In the interest of time, I will take one more question from the student. Vansaj Mehta, would you please just pick up your question to the speaker?
Yes, sir. Good evening. Actually, I was asking, sir, that how are we going to generate the flexibility for the future smart cities?
Since you're talking about smart cities, so let me give you some sense of what the smart city idea itself is. And in order to understand it, first we need to understand what preceded it. See, it's not the case that the central government has never done urban interventions. But there is a problem with the central government's urban interventions because, remember, urban governance is ultimately a ground level local thing. Either the municipality or at most the state government is looking after it. So how does the central government do urban interventions? This is the tricky point. And the old way of doing urban interventions was to have, as I said, the top-down planning commission view of doing it. So you sat down and wrote out sort of building codes for the whole country, for example. Right? Now, what happens as a result of it is that you create these monstrosities around the country. You see, before you look at cities built before 1950, you'll see that they're all very different, which is obvious because culture, climate, everything changes from as you go to different parts of the country. So before 1950, different parts of the country built different kinds of cities. But after 1950, we all began to build those horrible cement CPWD boxes. And essentially till very, very recently, that is the bulk of the construction even today is basically concrete boxes, which some of you will sadly go on to do. But why is this happening? It is happening because you are following certain codes which were laid down from the top. So unless you go out there and put in a lot of effort and break out of them in some fashion, and the odd large corporate may be able to do it like DLF in Cyber Hub area. But by and large, you'll have to stick to those codes. So this is a top-down system. Similarly, they used to have something called JNURM. So JNURM would decide, okay, XYZ city will be given so much money to have buses. We will going to have public transport is a good thing. So we are going to give every city a certain amount of money to buy buses. And so you'll have absurd situations like bendy buses being purchased for a hill city like Shillong, where those bendy buses just can't go up and down those narrow roads. So this is exactly why The smart city approach is a completely different approach. Now, let me right up front tell you, the smartness of a smart city has nothing to do with smartphones or digital anything. People get confused because they use smartphones. They think that smart cities has something to do with smartness of digital. It may have, but that is not the core idea. The core idea about smartness is that smartness comes from decentralization, i.e., that different cities have a different view of what they want to be done. And so it is a bottom-up system. So when the smart city project was set going about 3-4 years ago, there was a contest in which the cities were themselves asked, and the citizens and the municipal managers were asked, what do you want? And so different cities came out with different things, and they were given money accordingly to do different things. And so if you look at the outcomes from the smart cities project, you will see very different outcomes happening in different cities. So let me give you some examples. The city of Indore used its smart city money to basically clean itself up. So basically in garbage management. It then later on spent its money in converting a 0.5 kilometer stretch of a road called Chappan into a night street food area. Now, there is no way the planning commission would have given money for street food sort of road and pedestrianize it and all that kind of thing, you know. But that's what Indore wanted, and that's what Indore got. And those of you who have visited Indore recently will notice that that is, you know, if you go there, it's got wonderful place to hang out at night till past midnight. There are lots of stalls that eat. It's just a clean, pedestrianized space for the city to hang around. Meanwhile, the rest of the city has also got cleaned up. And so Indore is a wonderful place to walk around because there's no garbage lying around and so on. So that was one kind of urban intervention. In Varanasi, the intervention is a different one. There the ghats are getting cleaned up. Another smart city intervention was to take all the wires that hang above you and put them underground. So Varanasi decided that they didn't like these wires, and they put them all underground because, you know, then the beauty of the old architecture could be seen. So Varanasi used its money for cleaning up the ghats and getting rid of all those irritating wires. So that's another way of using up money. And there are cities where, example, Agartala did not have a system of traffic lights. For a small town, until very recently didn't have enough traffic to warrant traffic management. So it built a control room. So Agartala used its smart city money to create a control room which manages traffic lights, manages electricity supply, manages garbage, sewage systems, water supply, etc. So that's what they did because, you know, small northeastern city didn't have some basic urban amenities in place and now has a control room to manage them. So that's what they did with their money, and so on and so forth. I, sitting here in the finance ministry, I'm completely agnostic to what people want to do. If people come up with a great idea, well, go ahead and do it. And so, like, there is a small town in Karnataka that used the money to clean up a temple tank and build. It's now become a nice a series of it's like a stepped well, and it's a temple tank, and it's a nice hangout place for people. In the evening, they go there and they sit around the tank and they chat or whatever. So cleaning up a temple tank is another place. Some other place may think of some completely other idea. That's perfectly fine with me. But it is a completely decentralized idea. That is what smart cities are about.
Thank you, Mr. Sanyal. Thank you very much. There are a few more questions, but in the interest of time, on behalf of the university and organizing UTC team, we thank you for your enlightening talk and also sharing some of your views related to urban planning and the emerging challenges in front of our urban ecosystem. I take this opportunity to invite Prerna to offer a memento to our keynote speaker. So what do you, Prerna?
Yes, sir.
A big round of digital applause for Mr. Sanyal for being able to join us, and thank you very much hopefully when the COVID scare is little low, we would be able to host you, invite you to our campus physically and interact with you. Thank you very much, sir, for being able to join. Have a good evening. I now invite Madam Sardar Muralidharan for your enlightening talk about risk-informed governance in Kerala. And I request Pedna to present the digital moment to Ms. Sardar Muralidharan. And again, a round of applause for Madam Sardar Muralidharan for your enlightening talk, sharing some of very innovative practices in Kerala. Thank you very much for being able to join us this evening. I now invite Prerna to present the digital memento to our esteemed guest, Joe Phelan, for his enlightening talk about the global sustainability and how to link businesses and pathways for sustainable development. Thank you very much, Joe, for being able to join us today, sharing your invaluable thoughts. And it's very, very interesting. As you know, we are grappling with a lot of challenges, and your thanks very much for your valuable inputs. I now request that the organizing team to present our digital memento to our partner, Tanea. Thank you, Tanea, for being able to join us. Obrigado from all of us in Ahmedabad, and I hope we'll be able to see you very soon here in India. And thank you very much for extending all the support on behalf of TU Delft, and also various speakers who would be able to join us during the next few days. I also take this opportunity to thank the university provost, Dr. Tridip Surud, for extending all his support. And also my colleagues who are here in the organizing team. A big round of applause for Professor Mona Iyer, who has been leading this initiative. So you need to please do a digital clap for Mona, especially spearheading this. And also Anil, who has been that anchoring this entire event from UTC 5, and the entire UTC team, particularly the team of the student who are led by Prerna, and the entire group of students who are supporting this entire event. And I would also like to extend all our alumni who are able to join us today. And I would invite that next 4 days are very exciting discussion, because we are grappling with this idea, what is this idea of risk and resilience? And as CEPT Provost mentioned about the aspects of understanding vulnerability, and also there are a lot of global perspective about risk to resilience. I would invite all our students and alumni to do join us from tomorrow, 12th, 13th, and the final concluding on 14th. So thank you very much for being able to join us. I know there are some very interesting questions which are there in the chat box, which we could not take up into in the interest of time. But do write us, and also use this opportunity to interact with us. So thank you very much, and I hand it over back to Prerna for the final. Over to you, Prerna.
Yes, sir. Thank you all for joining, but I would also request you to stay back. We'll begin with the next session within the next 5 minutes. The next session, it will talk about the role of planning education and how that can forward the efforts towards resilience and recovery in Indian urban cities.
Varsha, can we start now this session? Because
Sure, sir.
audience are waiting now. Yeah.
Yeah. Prerna, are we good to go? Can we start?
Yes, Varsha, you may.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We welcome you again to the Urban Thinkers Campus, which is the 6th session going around this time. The first session for this year's session would be the roundtable round 1, which would be hosted by Anil Roy sir. And we have 4 speakers for this session. I would like to invite our speakers onto the platform. To give a brief introduction of our speakers, our first guest for today is Professor Anjali Chettiparam. She is the Professor of Urban Planning and Governance at the Department of Real Estate and Planning at the Henley Business School, University of Reading in UK. She has researched and published on a range of issues in India and the UK, including the nature of public interest, community engagement, circular economy, land management, scalar governance, and the delivery of services such as school meals, health, and housing. She's currently the managing editor of the Journal of Planning Theory, and the Secretary General of Association of European Schools of Planning. Angelique has previously served as Director of Studies, Real Estate and Planning, and School of Director of Academic Tutoring at the Henley Business School. And she is currently also part of the Excellence in Education Board of AESOP and the Core Curriculum Review Panel of AESOP as well. Besides this, she is the external examiner for planning courses at several universities in the UK and in Ireland. Welcome, ma'am. Our next speaker for the evening is Dr. Lakshmi Ramasubramanian from AICP. She is an architect and urban planner with over 20 years of research and practice experience in participatory planning and community engagement. Her research is immersive, using a wide range of empirically based geospatial analysis and modeling techniques alongside anthropographic and archival methods. She's a recognized expert in doing participatory geographic information science and citizen science. Her research successfully argues that GIS has the capacity to level the play field, placing data and information directly in the hands of communities most affected by policy decisions. Her books, GIS Science and Public Participation and Essential Methods for Planning Practitioners, uses case studies of real-world planning projects to demonstrate the power of participatory planning. In 2019, she received the Dale Scholar Prize Award by Cal Poly Panoma for her scholarship on reflective practice. Dr. Ramasubramaniam currently leads the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at San Jose State University, serving as the department chair and is newly elected as the president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. Welcome, ma'am. Our next speaker for the evening would be Professor Daniel K.B. Inkum from FIGP. He is the professor at the Department of Planning at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology and visiting associate professor at the School of Planning, Architecture and Planning at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. He's a fellow of the Ghana Institute of Planners and sits on the International Advisory Board of the South Urbanism Masters Program at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He has been steering the community chair of Association of African Planning Schools and currently represents the AAPS at the Council of the Global Planning Educators Association Network. His research interests include urban environmental governance, climate change, and natural resources management. Welcome, sir. Our final speaker for the evening would be Mr. Leo Vandenberg. He is a design teacher since 2003. Trained as an architect, he got to know more about urbanism through practice. After having taught at the Academies of Architecture of Amsterdam and Maastricht, he settled at the Technological University of Delft. Leo wrote and edited books on urban analysis techniques and Dutch urban practice, as well as the cultural history as a driver for design. He was involved in research on historical Dutch inner city transformations and on the Dutch Delta region. He believes design is multidimensional. It can help in solving urgent real-life problems, but design can be more than that. It can be used as a tool to inspire. It can serve as a wake-up call, be used as a source of pleasure. It can point out to utopias of the future or to those of the past. It can be poetry. It can even be all of this at the same time.
As a graduate teacher, Leo always invites his students to explore this richness inherent to design profession. Welcome, sir. Thank you for being here this evening, and I would like Anil Roy, sir, to carry forward the session from here on. Thank you.
Thank you, Varsa. Yes, this was a great panel to have, for this evening, and we are getting late into the evening, and audience are also having one session gone already. I'm quickly going to, begin this session with kind of a question that we are going to deliberate on, 4 of us here, and then read out this question. I'm going to read out all the questions here, and no sequencing, nothing. Whoever wants to answer these questions or go beyond these questions would be welcome. So let me read out the question that we have set for this particular roundtable today. And I'll have to look at my Word file here. Yes, the questions are, what are the roles and responsibilities of Planning Schools Association in Global North and Global South? Are these planning schools open to the idea of incorporating the issues of climate change and resilience recovery from natural and human disaster into their respective curriculum? And how are they doing it? Are there any examples that can help scale up the idea of incorporating various planning approaches, tools and techniques of climate change and disaster risk reduction in adapting in planning pedagogy, studios, field-based learning, lecture courses, research projects, etc.? Why it is relevant to incorporate these into the learning of urban planning, and how are these have larger impacts on the profession in the long run? And the last one is, are there any possibility for cross-learning from the existing experience from and between these planning schools across the world? So this is what my questions are for this particular session, and we can go fast. First round, I'm going to open it for the speakers here. 5 minutes each of you can pick up any question and answer, or you can go on your own and bring us the experiences that is there with you, with your own current positions, and how these planning educations can take up the issues and challenges of resilient recovery. Thank you. May I request, Angelique to begin with? I'm just sorry, I'm just picking up a random name, but yes, I over to you, Angelique.
Thank you, Anil, and a very good afternoon to you from the UK. I know it's good evening to most of you over there in India. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, especially Anil and the team that have been behind contacting us and organizing us and speaking to us over the last few days. For me, this session, I'm so glad to be here with Lakshmi and Daniel, because it's for me so much also about learning from what the other associations are doing, the ACSP and ARPS, as much as sharing what we are doing in ASOP. So ASOP essentially stands for the Association of European Schools of Planning. It is a membership association, and it is it's got 403 member schools at the moment. So it's pretty large, with around 50 individual members as well. Our members are primarily schools. So it's not individuals, it's primarily schools. So it was established in 1987 and has been going on ever since then. One of the few things that perhaps is common with maybe the African planning schools, but is different from the ACSP, is that this association is an association of schools across many countries. So we are dealing with national legal frameworks of planning, which can be very different and denoting different planning cultures. So for instance, in the Southern Europe, you can get more of architecture-based planning approaches, more importance given to that, while as here where I am in the UK, there is more of geography input in the way how planning is practiced and even planning how it is taught. So we are dealing with diversity, and this has its opportunities as well as constraints in how we have sought to work. One other important difference, I suppose, is that ESOP is entirely voluntary. So there is no professional or so kind of a core secretariat. So we work on a voluntary basis, and that is a significant part also of how ESOP does things. Just to touch upon the activities that we engage in, our main aim is to promote research and teaching amongst our member schools. So wherever they are, whichever tradition they come from, we are here to see that they can grow both in terms of research as well as teaching. So how do we do that? In terms of research, of course, we have this main ESOP Congress where we have often, for last Congress in Venice, we had around 1,000 and 1,000 plus registrations. And along with the Congress, we have tracks, definitely, as most Congresses do. We also have special sessions and roundtables, which enable our members, individuals from our member schools to organize particular interest sessions. So that's the Congress activity is one major thing. Besides that, we also have 17 thematic groups within our association. So these are thematic groups that are voluntary. It's bottom-up, formed in a bottom-up way. So people who come together, have an interest in something, they come together and they propose a thematic group. They then continue with their activities over the year. We support them to a certain extent in their activities. So we have 17 of these, and one of them is risk and resilience and risk mitigation group. Besides that, we have annual lectures. So we call somebody who is well known, and again, it's a bottom-up venture. So somebody can propose, and we support those annual lectures. We also give 2 awards: the Best Published Paper Award, as well as the Best Congress Paper Award. So that's the kind of things that we do on research. On teaching side, we have a head of school meeting every year. And this is essentially focused on design or on discussing planning education issues and issues in connection with planning education, pedagogy, and so on. So the heads of school meeting is important. We also have a co-curriculum. Again, the current co-curriculum is a bit dated, so we are now in the process of rewriting the co-curriculum. It is a big task. As I said, we are diverse, and having the diversity is a big challenge in putting forward a co-curriculum that everybody, all of our member schools can recognize themselves with. The third thing that we do is a quality recognition exercise. This is not accreditation. So we do not accredit any planning goals, but we recognize quality. And this is more focused on the pedagogic side. So we encourage good pedagogic practices by this quality recognition, and member schools can put themselves forward to be assessed for a quality recognition. Programs put themselves forward to be recognized for quality recognition, and we have detailed criteria and so on. There's an Excellence in Education board that looks after this process. And also we have an award of excellence in teaching. It's called the Excellence in Teaching Award. And for the 2020, it's themed in 2020, the theme was teaching resilience and resilient teaching, for instance. So these are the different themes, and we therefore choose particular kinds of challenges that planning conference is confronted with, and we discuss that. I must also mention besides research and teaching, we have a very vibrant young academics. I'm sure some of you at least would have been either directly involved in it. It is a very inclusive society. And one of the things that we are quite proud of in ESOP is that it is quite an inclusive society. So we have quite a number of international members as well, not just from Europe. We have different membership categories, and we encourage different members coming and signing up to ESOP, but also many of our prizes are open to international members schools. For instance, the best published paper can be given to anybody. It does not necessarily have to be somebody from Europe. So Young Academics is also a membership organization of young academics, mostly PhD students, but they don't have to be. They may be associated. They have to be associated with a member school in Europe when they start with, but then they graduate, they move, and we have young academics now everywhere, in all countries, in almost all countries of the world. So it's quite, they have a PhD workshop, and they also have a young academics conference. They also collaborate with ESOP on a number of projects which we co-deliver. And some of these are, for instance, ESOP Memories. This is an oral, this is a project to capture oral histories of how ESOP was formed, and we are documenting it, and we kind of have videos and so on, and that is a collaborative project between young academics and ESOP. We have journals, 2 journals, Planext and Transactions, which focus both on research and teaching. So it's not just research, but also teaching. And there are institutional organization strengthening projects that are like, we are improving how to do, improving our website, for instance. We are improving institutional repository and such projects. And we also kind of organized quite regularly now ESOP future consultations. So we consult with the members quite regularly to try to see what the members are thinking in terms of where ESOP should be going. So we have the executive committee board and country representatives board and so on. But other than that, we try and engage with members directly as well. As one of the speakers earlier was talking about the continuously evolving world, we try to capture that and also have a feel about the diversity that that our association represents, and to make sure that we are representing that diversity in the way we choose to go forward. So that's generally about how ESOP is trying to serve its members, let's say. I'll leave it at that, and I'll go on to some other question later on. Yeah.
Thank you, Angli. Can I request Dr. Lakshmi Ramasubramanian to come in, please?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's 6 a.m. in California, and so I've woken up for an important cause. I'm going to represent my university, which is San Jose State University. I'm an architect and a planner. I studied in India and I came to this country, and I've been here for quite some time. Right now, I'm the department chair at San Jose State University's Urban and Regional Planning Department. And I think my connection here is because I'm also president of the Association of the Collegiate Schools of Planning. Now, we call it ACSP. ACSP was founded 50 years ago, and it's a consortium, just like ESOP, of university-based programs that offer credentials in urban planning, urban and regional planning. So we are over 100 programs in USA and Canada, and we include affiliate members and who are interested in planning, and we also welcome individual members. So when ACSP was created, we wanted to make sure that there's a place where we could talk about planning education and where we could engage with students, with scholars, future scholars, right? And so in the US, the American Planning Association is where it's the world of practice, and the ACSP is where the academic folks, the students, and everybody comes together. Of course, there's lots of interplay and connection. So our association does 3 things, let's say. So the main thing is we advance scholarship because we're an academic association, which means we host an annual conference Next year, we are going to partner with our Canadian colleagues and hold a conference in Toronto. So that might be of interest to you. It's in November every year. We do have virtual opportunities for participation, something we've learned because of COVID to do things virtually. We publish a peer-reviewed journal called the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, which accepts articles for publication from planning scholars. And we work in partnership with the American Planning Association and the American Institute of Certified Planners to accredit planning programs in the US, and that's through the Planning Accreditation Board. So that's kind of in a nutshell what our association does, but I wanted to pick up on one of the questions that Dr. Roy had for us, is to talk about climate change. And so I'm going to take a little bit of my time to talk about climate change and what the association is trying to do with respect to climate change. So our association has made a commitment to center conversations about the climate crisis by doing a few things, right? So we want to sort of take the conversation from talking in a very abstract and academic way about doing research on climate change to talking about climate justice. And so that pivot is something that I'm also championing as a presidential priority. And that means now an acknowledgement that this is a global challenge, which means we have to think and talk and engage globally. And so part of the reason that I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you all is that to signal and to communicate that we want to not to try to do it alone, but to actually work in partnership, in genuine partnership, and with colleagues around the world, particularly with future planners, because I mean, this is an audience of planning students, and you are going to be at the forefront of dealing with these crises. And so it's so critical that we engage and connect with you. And so we do have a climate action task force that we formed, and that task force had hosted a virtual conference not too long ago on climate change and planning pedagogy. And so basically, we had 70 scholars come virtually like this and talk about what different people are doing in their own way, in their classrooms, to engage with this issue of climate change. And that's a small start. We want to continue this work. And I can take on more later on, but what I want to sort of emphasize is that the speakers, the keynote speakers have pointed it out, right? That climate justice is so critical and so challenging because the impacts are very variable. And the impacts are different depending on where geopolitically, geolocationally you're situated. So there's an intersection between spatial planning and climate justice planning. But at the same time, I think as planners, we have to think about questions of intersectionality, which means that you cannot see climate change and climate justice as separate from social change and social justice and empowerment and so on, right? And so that is something that I'm hoping we can continue to talk about later today. And maybe I'll stop there and hand it off to Dr. Anil.
Thank you, Dr. Ramasubramanian. It was really insightful to think of the gamut of planning and intersectionality that is emerging, which is a point in concern, that how we bring it into the classroom, this particular debate, and how we take it forward from there. Next, I'm inviting Daniel to come in, please, and share his experiences in that.
All right, thank you very much, Anil, for this invitation. It's a big pleasure for me to be on this platform and also to speak to what I believe to be a majority Indian audience. because I still remember my time with the Institute of Town Planners Day in 2017, when I was a guest speaker. And I still have very good memories of some of the exchanges that happened there. I'm from Ghana, as I was introduced, but I also had a chance to have part of my education in Western Europe, in Finland, Norway, Germany, and also in the USA. And I'm representing the Association of African Planning Schools. In 1999, we came together to think about the whole idea of planning education. And we felt that those of us in the global South needed to think about how we could reform and promote planning, and also raise the idea of planning from the global South. So the Association of African Planning Schools was formed essentially to rethink the whole idea of planning and to debate the issues that concern African cities, because we thought that most African cities had a particular context, and most of the time in the discussions, the peculiar context of our African cities were more or less neglected in global discussions. So the Association of African Schools currently is made up of about 54 planning schools in about 15 countries, mostly in Anglophone Africa, spread over the West, East, North, and then also South of Africa. We have a couple of programs that we help our member institutions to do, but essentially we are a knowledge network, a voluntary organization, just as Angelique mentioned. We connect through digital means, and I think COVID has made it even much more relevant now, the need to communicate digitally. So we use social networks to promote planning reform, planning education across countries in Africa. I think one of the interesting things about our association is the fact that we have collaborations with institutions, and I'm going to mention just two of them. One is the Slum or Shack Dwellers International. That collaboration allows us to give our member institutions and the students of these institutions some kind of experiential learning, because what happens is that we try to take the studios out of the universities, out of the classrooms, and practicalize it on the field. And this collaboration with the Shack Dwellers International has really been a very interesting aspect of the association's work. And we have documented some of the experiences that we have had with them. And then also we have a collaboration with WeGo, which is the Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And as we know, WeGo's main area of concern is informality in our cities. And I think that that has also help the association to give our next generation of planners the need to really look at how our cities look like and how we can respond to these issues. Having said that, I would just want to respond to some of the issues that Anil, the questions that you mentioned. I think that we in 2018 or a year before that, decided that we were going to focus our attention on a program that we called Revitalizing Planning Education Across Africa. And the whole idea was to look at the way our planners are trained, because we know that most of the planning schools in Africa have a tradition, either from Europe or America. My own planning school took its tradition from planning schools in Great Britain. So we, for example, have until recently the Town and Country Planning Act, which was almost verbatim taken from the UK. and implemented upon our cities in Ghana. So we started to interrogate some of these issues, and we felt that we needed to reform planning education, rethink planning education, so that we'll be able to tackle the peculiar issues that confront human settlements in the global South. So we felt that to do that, we needed to look at the curriculum. What kind of courses are we teaching? Are we just borrowing from the UK or America, and how do they fit into the particular context of African cities? So this whole revitalization of planning education led us to look at our curricula, look at the contextual issues and how the curriculum responds to the contextual issues that we face. And I think for many of the Indian students who are listening, this might be very interesting. The key question is, where do you draw your traditions? Do these traditions respond to the context within which you find yourself as a planner? And we thought that by doing that, it will then generate the next generation of planners who are particular about their context and are able to have the tools to be able to resolve the issues that we face. And so looking at the issue of climate change, I think it was one of the issues that came up, and that led the association, for example, to design what we call a model master's program in Zambia, taking into consideration all these critical issues that we face, especially with climate resilience and all of that. And so far, we think that that program has been very successful, and it has given us a lot of lessons that show us how we can respond to particularly wicked problems as we know them, especially with climate change, related to climate change in the African context. So we continue to work together. Unfortunately, because of the fact that we have not been able to raise the finances to allow us to meet face-to-face, we have only been able to have about 4 in-person all schools conference in Tanzania, in South Africa, and I think we had one also in Kenya. That experience for me was a very good landmark, because then it allowed the all schools meeting allowed us to meet face-to-face and to discuss the challenges that we face across Africa. So now we have a network of, for example, if I'm talking about African planners in any specific discipline, I can easily call my colleagues in West Africa, in East Africa, North Africa, South Africa. And that idea of collaboration, I think, has been very useful in responding to the peculiar issues that we face, especially with climate change. And I think that is what I would want to leave, that with collaboration, we can tackle many of the issues that we face related to climate and its effects on our cities. And I hope that we'll be able to discuss further and to look at the particular actions that we can take to respond to the issues of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I'll just move on to Leo to give his insights into these questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Anil, and thank you all for having me here. I'm very happy to, as I said before, to reach out to CEPT as a former exchange student. It's very nice to have a link with India again. I'm very proud to represent my home university, the TU Delft, where I am the section leader of the urban design section. And I can quickly sketch out the way that our education is structured, and also how sustainability in general is embedded in that program. So, well, we have a 3 years bachelor's program, which we always feel very strongly for, that it is a broad education. So people are not only introduced into architecture, but they are also introduced to urbanism, to building technology, to real estate and housing, problems, etc. And we pride ourselves in being taking an integral approach to design. And after 3 years, our students choose one of 4 master tracks where they do a graduation program. Our bachelor's curriculum was remodeled or changed 8 or 9 years ago. And ever since that moment, sustainability was considered a key issue. But the big question was always, how can we integrate this in all of our education? The big danger, of course, being that if you integrate sustainability in everything, it sort of evaporates at the same time. So it was always a choice of making it very explicit in certain courses that were all about sustainability, or letting it play a small role in any assignment. Well, I think our school has chosen for the second option, that sustainability issues and climate change, etc., are a key question in any design assignment. And we have climate issues not only represented in our design assignments, but also in more technically oriented courses, and that goes for our bachelor's education as well as our master's education. Yes, I think we have long passed the point that we as design teachers or design educators can say that it is an option to deal with climate issues. Of course, they ought to be, I guess, or that would be my statement, to be an integral part of any education. And I would like to point out, I would like to come back to the first question that Anil posed us. What are the roles and responsibilities of planning schools, associations in Global North and Global South? Well, I think my personal view on this is, of course, climate does not know a northern climate or a southern climate that are in any way separated from each other. So there's only one way ahead, and that is to see this as a joint interest and a joint program. So I completely agree with the previous speakers that we should collaborate, or else all of our energies might be in vain. So yes, this is, I think, an assignment to all of us. So yes, I would like to keep it at that for the moment.
Yeah. Thanks, Leo. Yes, very good insight, and the final word that you said, that there cannot be north, south, east, west, as far as climate change is concerned. Particularly, I put it north and south because of the adaptation part of it. The risk and vulnerability at Dhaka and risk and vulnerability at California might be different, and the adaptation because of the capacity, technological capacity, financial capacity, and know-how are different. The stages of development is different, and that's how these kind of differences and nuances are coming up. And Daniel also mentioned that the only one school could pick up that climate change, into the course and curriculum. So evolving the seriousness and recognition to the issues by the planning educations is very important. And in Indian case, we have not been able to still, be open to all sorts of adaptations coming into our course curriculum while we are doing spatially or otherwise. So yes, moving on to the next round of remaining questions, I would invite now from the audience if there is any interventions from our colleagues and our professional planners who are attending it. Would be really nice interventions. You may go ahead and ask question, or you can add intervention, or you can share your experiences. And then after that, we will have concluding rounds for this roundtable. Yes. So anyone would like to intervene with the speakers, or you can send your questions in chat box. Yes, Versa, could you receive any questions?
No, sir. As of now, there's nothing in the chat box. If anyone does present a question, it would be visible to all of us here.
Okay, okay. If there are any direct question without writing in the chat box, we would welcome you. And I would request some of my colleagues who can, at least intervene in this discussion to go forward.
While we're waiting for comments in the chat, I was wondering in sort of one of the things that we have been thinking about here in ACSB is really this project, which is bottom up, which is low resource intensive, which is to assemble syllabi. Which is just like encouraging people to share their syllabi on different topics, because, under the umbrella of climate change, you can talk about energy, you can talk about water, you can talk about adaptation planning, policy, and all of them have usually a syllabus and readings and so on. So one of the things we're trying to stand up is this sort of low-tech approach of just building a kind of a Google Doc or something where people can put links to their work. And I think, we started it in the US, but I think it would be something that we can do relatively easily across, boundaries. And I wonder whether that will be of interest or whether that's something that students would think is useful. I'm just curious.
Just to continue what the theme that Lakshmi just started, I just wanted to say that I mentioned one of the thematic groups, the resilience and risk mitigation strategies thematic group. Well, they have conducted a study of all Yesso schools to see how much climate change content there is in our courses across Europe. So what they did is they worked with the young academics, and this was another of those joint projects. Essentially, the methodology was because course material in most European situation is available online. So the idea was to look at the websites, look into the course descriptions, look into the course content, which is available online. There was a set of keywords chosen associated with climate change and to actually see how much they occur. So there was a whole session, an Urban Thinkers Campus session on Monday the 8th that was discussing this particular study. I can share the link to the recording in the chat if anybody wants to follow it up. But that session gives you the information about what has come from that particular study. One of the things that they found was that around 28.4% of our undergraduate courses, total credits were devoted to climate change. And in the postgraduate level, that was 34.1% of our postgraduate courses, total credits was devoted to climate change. So this is obviously, it is within the limits or within the parameters of how the study was conducted. Yeah, but I think one of the things about planners and climate change, I think is planners as such bring a number. There's this very specific, very scientific or very specific skills and knowledge that is associated with climate change, which is very specialized, but there's also a set of generic skills that is required. And that is where I think planners fare really well, because as part of our education as planners, we are introduced to the idea of comprehensiveness or the interlinkages, or we are trained not to think about issues in isolation. We tend to think about the interlinkages, where's the gaps, where's the, where's the trade-offs, how can you create opportunities? And that, I think, is a strong thing. So even when we say that it's only 28.4% or whatever, the rest of it is also bringing in skills that is so essential to climate change education. And I think that's one of the major things that we bring. So we also have this, there's a major drive towards decentralized approaches. For instance, in the UK, there's this drive to decentralize energy systems and so on. But even then, you need to also know how to embed this decentralized approach within both the geography as well as the institutional landscape, the different scales, both upward and downward, the neighborhood scales, the regional scales. And that is something, again, which planners are. We try to get our students to do it. So again, it is that set of generic skills that's so useful to climate change. We know about scales. We talk about navigation between scales in our classes, even if it is not in relation to climate change. There is also an awareness, by and large, especially nowadays, about complexity and uncertainty. We are increasingly, our curriculum is starting to deal with complexity and uncertainty. And as a planner, as an individual planner, we are also very focused on developing personal attributes of a planner, such as how do you mobilize a community? How do you facilitate a discussion? How do you connect people? How do you reinforce something? All of it is so essential to climate change. So I don't know whether looking at it in that way, whether any of what we deal in planning is redundant as when it comes to climate change. I'll stop
Leo,
at that.
You have raised your hand. Please go ahead. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Anil, and thank you, Angelique, because I couldn't agree with you more. I think these generic traits that you are speaking of are essential in dealing the incredibly complex design or planning questions. But I wanted to point out one other thing, and that is that for many people, say the people who we work for, say we represent a common interest, right? Of the people who are in our countries, and I think for many of them it is extremely difficult to understand what the consequences of climate change might be. And I think design and planning are also how do you say that, disciplines, sorry, that's the word I was looking for, two disciplines who can bring those, who can visualize the consequences, who can, but not only the dangers or the threats, but also the possibilities, and to give people hope that that through our design interventions or through our planning interventions, we can indeed contribute to a solution, but that we can also visualize that the qualities that this may bring, because I think we are dealing also with a lot of fear for change or an unknown future. And I think one of the responsibilities of our planners is not only to think about concrete ways of improving situations, but also to make visible for the people what this future might look like and bring it closer like that.
That's true, yes. Yeah, Daniel, please go ahead, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to latch on Leo's words and just to say that one of the strengths that I think planning education brings is this whole idea of transdisciplinarity, trans and interdisciplinarity, because much as we know about the projections, I mean, we know all the modeling, the 3-degree rise, temperature rise, and all of that. We can do various projections and anticipate what the situation will look like. But dealing with the impacts of a temperature rise, for example, is something that none of us can say has the hold on. And I think that's where planning education can come in very handy. We can do the modeling and think of what is likely to happen in a future scenario, but then how do we deal with uncertainty? How do we deal with the situation that we are not familiar with? And I think this is where planners can come in with a kind of a vast trans and interdisciplinary approach to be able to mobilize responses to what are likely to be very difficult situations that may come as a result of climate impacts. I think that, yes, and Anil, you made an allusion to that, because you mentioned the fact that we can adapt. There are adaptation issues, but the level to which we can adapt depends so much on the extent to which we are resourced. I mean, if you take a city that is well prepared, then we may say that they may be able to respond much more in a structured manner than those that are not really prepared. And I think this is where we can prepare our students in planning to be able to design the approach that will allow us to be able to respond to emergencies. And I think, Angelique, you mentioned even community entry techniques. How do you mobilize people? How do you, in terms of disaster, how do you get people together? What should first responders do? And all those things need to be organized. And I think planning has the chance to frame it in a way that will allow us to adapt to the changes that we may anticipate.
Yes, of course. Then before I go to Dr. Ramasubramanian, it reminds me, this multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity edge that we have in planning curriculum gives us, some sort of thinking ahead. And the more flexible are the subject domain in the planning curriculum, the more adaptation and more preparedness can be brought in. Some of the examples that in Indian planning schools curriculum, there is a rigidity of entry of the different discipline into the planning courses is very, very, very killing, I would suggest. It's open to only 5 disciplines yet, geography, economy, civil engineering, architect, and sociologists, these 5 disciplines only. This pandemic put up the serious challenges, and none of us were trained, public health experts. So, and then if there is some public health experts can really, help the team of who is managing the rescue operations, or kind of approach that we needed for the emergency services. We were clueless. Different actors came in. Climate warriors, the COVID warriors in terms of police and medical officers were running up front. We were taking back seats and watching. Some extent, we are providing the shelter homes or makeshift hospitals and all kinds of things. That was our job. So I think this kind of rigidity has to, go off and try to bring in more discipline into. The one thing is that climate change science per se, and one is the adaptability and application part of it, where the planning curriculum can chip in and bring out that applications into the course curriculum and brought in. And like you gave that percentage idea of how much master's course are incorporating the climate change. I did one of the study in 3 schools in India with NIA and UNDP sponsored project I was mentioning in our discussion there. I thought I'd bring it. The IIT Kharagpur, SPA Delhi and CEPT, we were talking about the courses, the few elective courses, no core courses were on either sustainable development or climate change or adaptation or anything. None of the schools. In fact, CEPT started some of the sustainable development as an elective courses. We had a exclusive environmental planning specialization, but we thought it is a cross-cutting subject, so we put these subjects into other specializations. But Kharagpur, one of the traditional schools, and I was going through their 50 years of thesis. Only 3 theses could come up with the title of climate change and adaptations. Whereas on the contrary, 40-year-old School of Planning, CEPT, we had at least around 25 theses done in last 40 years, containing the climate change and adaptation and related issues. So, and SPA also to some extent similar ideas come up, but we kind of rigid in terms of opening up the domain for the rest of the discipline to come in and help planning education in tackling these issues, because cities are generally this multicultural, multidisciplinary approach. The subject purity for architecture and civil engineering is not going to help anymore, because the fast changing circumstances, the way we are developing it, and particularly in global south, I'm sorry, Leo, I'm still bringing this context. If you keep that climate change issues per se, but then adaptation is really, capacity, to deal with technological advancement, financial opportunity, and knowledge. Many of us have no knowledge about what is the consequences and how we could visualize and bring it to the course curriculum. So I think there are various challenges in opening up this curriculum to vast resources that we have outside the planning discipline with different discipline, so to say. Yes, I can request now Dr. Brahma Subramanian to please join in the discussion, and then we can summarize in another 5 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Anil. I agree very much with my colleagues about the benefits of integrating, climate change conversations in the core of the planning education, and the value of thinking interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and so on. So I'm all for it. But one of the challenges we're having here is that when we have an accredited planning degree, which has 48 units or 48 credits, we are packing so much into this accredited degree that our colleagues and professors are saying, everything is now required. So we have a required unit on sustainable cities and communities that's required in every accredited planning program, right? So we have that in the core. So what are we going to take out in order to put new things in? Otherwise, the degree will go on for, 3 years instead of 2 years. And yes. In the meantime, you can get a business degree in 1 year. And students are saying, hey, I don't want to be in school for 2.5 years. I want to get a degree in a year and go work and make money. And so that's a tension that we have as it's very hard to sort of advocate for requiring something, because then that has impacts on the length of program and so on, right? So that's a challenge we're struggling with.
That's true, yes. Angelique, please.
Yeah, listening to again, Lakshmi, I was just thinking, absolutely. I think for me, one of the major challenges in introducing is this, also the specialist generalist kind of so to increase climate change content, do you put it in core modules? Do you put it in an elective? If it is in core content, how much is adequate? How much is enough? The studies showed that gave some figure of 1 point something of total credits. Is that enough or is that not? Given that we planners also need to have other skills and what goes out. But the other wider thing is also, as climate change scientists, we are dealing with different disciplines, as Dan pointed out. It is about creating in our students the understanding of disciplinary rationals. So But so when an engineer comes and presents a particular, we need to not just understand it, we need to understand the disciplinary culture so that we can understand and work and collaborate with that person. So an understanding and exposure to different disciplinary cultures is, again, I think, one of the challenges of a climate change scientist or planner coming out. The third question for me is really, is accreditation the best route to do this? Because do we do this through accreditation, making sure that you have so many, or as some have pointed out, maybe accreditation is not the better route. Maybe it is encouraging more faculty who research on climate change, for instance, and so that they bring in their expertise without an accreditation, top-down whip, so to speak, but it is people, faculty who are doing climate change research and therefore just bringing their research into the curriculum. So which is the way, if you're looking from a kind of a more strategic view, which is the best way to encourage? Do you put money into research or do you put money into accreditation standards? So these I think are some of the dilemma. But again, a wider dilemma, however, is the recognition of planning as a profession and its due place in wider policies. I think this is something that is shared across all our regions, maybe to a certain extent. There may be less and more of this challenge in particular areas. Within Europe, it's more of a challenge in some regions, it's less of a challenge, but we are continually confronted with this challenge of how do we ensure planning has its due place in the wider policies. We know that the skills we can bring, but does the policy landscape or those in governance really know it? And there is associations. That's where associations can do some work in creating that awareness and creating that space for those for planning. Generally advocating for planning as a discipline more than anything else. I'll leave it with that.
Okay. Can we take up some of the questions raised hand from the audience, and then we come back to our discussion and conclude this session? Yeah, I could see some of the hands there.
We have one question in the chat box, sir.
Okay.
It says, as we talk about collaboration, what would that one trait or reform could be that Indian planning education could adopt from its international contemporaries?
Dr. Ramasubramanian, can you come in, please, for this question?
I had put my response in the chat, actually, and I can say it here.
Oh, yes, I can see
think that from one of the things that we could adopt is really to engage more critically with the political. Like Angelique was just saying that, planning has a lot to offer. We think multidisciplinary, we have the systems thinking, we think about complex adaptive systems and all that. But it seems to me that decision makers often don't connect directly with planners and the planning profession, at least in the United States. And so just expanding from that, I thought that we should spend much more time thinking about how do we communicate directly with those decision makers and to get them to think about the value of a planning perspective, if you will, or a comprehensive or long range perspective. So it's really about also communication. And Leo was saying that before, right? Like, how do you visualize change? How do you communicate change? How do you make a good argument and not to shy away from the political? I think that's something that planners, I think we can't say we've got the best ideas, come and get it. I think we have to almost go and sort of market these ideas in a way, right? And we're not trained to do that. We're trained to be like, I got the best knowledge. Like
yes. And we are the best negotiator also between the decision makers and our clients. Other hand, I would go to Daniel and then Leo for the concluding remarks, and then I can go for thank you session.
Okay.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes.
I just wanted to emphasize the fact that it is not us and them, especially when it comes to planners and politicians. And I think this is the mindset that we need to change in our planning curriculum, that we need to constantly engage with the political decision makers. But if we create a culture where we claim to know and they don't know, and so we build silos, then we don't get anywhere. So I think one of the things that we need to focus attention on is to look at the fact that without them, the planning process cannot proceed. You do all the good technical things, but you need political approval. So right from the beginning of our planning education, we should begin to see politicians as our allies in the whole planning process so that we can make a headway. That's one point that I wanted to make. The second one is the dilemma. And I think, Angelique, you mentioned it, of accreditation. That might not do it. In one of the critical issues that we faced in the Association of African Planning Schools was the fact that as we were thinking about revitalizing and rethinking planning to make it more, let me say, Afrocentric, some of our colleagues were running for accreditation in Europe, and so we had a situation where they said, well, we wanted to be global. If I qualify as a planner, I want to have, let's say, town planning accreditation in the UK so that I can become global. But at the same time, I also want to be contextual in the sense that I want to respond to the critical issues that confront me. So we sometimes enter into a dilemma where we want to make sure we respond to the local context, but at the same time, we want a foreign institution to accredit us because we also want to be globally valuable. And I think these are some of the tensions that we have to constantly deal with so that we can borrow from UK, from America, whatever we think is good, but localize it to a particular developmental context.
Yes. Leo, please.
Yes, I also wanted to come back on the question about collaboration and how Indian planning education could learn from its international contemporaries. Of course, I find this very difficult to answer, but there is one thing that that there's another dimension, perhaps another dilemma, and that is between, say, educating people as generalists or as specialists. I think that the schools have an important role here. For instance, in the Netherlands, of course, we are used to seeing climate change most of all as a function of sea level rise, right? We have a water issue. That is through our thinking on sustainability, it's at the core. We live in a delta, so it's a delta issue that we are that we are dealing with also. And I think that our schools, we should not be afraid to say develop these specializations responding to our own local challenges. We all say if we want to find each other in collaboration, it is especially useful if we know that there are different specializations that we can find with each other. So I would invite anybody also in India to think about, okay, what is the angle that we find most pressing for us in this in all of this enormous problem field? What is the angle that we could specialize ourselves in and to build a track record on? And I think this would be valuable, I think, for any planning school, especially if you want to collaborate and find knowledge where you don't have it yourself.
So, yeah, almost we are on time to finishing with Leo. And if there is any question from audience, we can take one or let's call it a day now. Any question, Prerna, on the chat box? No. Mona, would you like to make any last word? Yes.
Not really last word, but thank you so much, all the panelists, Leo, Angelique, Lakshmi, and Daniel. It was so wonderful. And at some point, I feel we all in our own geography struggle with similar issues of, generalization versus specialization, how much to pack up into our curriculum versus how much to leave it for lifetime learning. And and the contextualization of the education, like someone trained in one part of the world, how does one practice in another part of the world? So all of it. So I really, it was a very, very enriching conversation. And I was just wondering that if this could be put together as a paper or a note, that would be a wonderful contribution to the planning fraternity. So those were the kind of thoughts in my mind, and very, very wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that.
You have done my job, Mona, so I have to just conclude. And yes, Jignesh is saying thank you so much for this panelists for excellent. Yeah, so it was really nice to connect all of you across the globe, and you have perspectives from different parts. At the same time, the climate change is global as well as local, of course, but the adaptation has to happen in the local domain and we are trying to be an actor in the local territorial management and planning system, because we work in the city context. So this is how the great message that we are getting from this panel, the collaborations, the nature of curriculum and the research and pedagogy, accreditations and all. We're struggling, same way Angelica is saying, the accreditation problem, top-down AICT in India, giving us 80 credit courses for bachelor and masters. It's too much to handle at the moment. And then these new innovative disciplines are emerging, GIS, for example, and gender and other things, which is very relevant for our discipline. So this question remains there, and how one can balance at the master's and bachelor's level is the real challenges of both public sponsored education system or also private universities emerging in a big way and coming up with planning courses. So I could see the pathways that is emerging in India. One is IIT pathways, where the spatial planning and town and country planning still dominates. Then we have SPAs coming up with some flexibilities of socio-cultural elements coming into, and the CEPT standing out with all sorts of multidisciplinary. But then we have to have that accreditation system yet on us. So thank you so very much for enriching this discussion, and we would try to learn lesson and keep our collaboration further so that we can have some. And I take that, how our planning profession, as Dr. Ramasubramanian saying, is make it more politically relevant. Political masters, decision makers should listen to us, unless we have 2, 3, 4 solutions of one problem. And that's how, I'm just concluding here with this message that we got. Thank you so very much. It's already dinner time for Indian audience, and you have to start Professor Lakshmi the day ahead. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us in this panel. Thank you, audience. You are the great audience. Still, I could see 55 people attending this, conference. Thank you so much.
Before we leave, we'd like to present a digital memento to all our speakers.
Yes, please. That's an honor. Thank you, Dan. So these are a small token of appreciation, and I request Varsa to send it across to their respective email boxes so that it remains there as a soft copy. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Good night from India.
Thank you, sir.